I stood by my daughter's coffin with my hands trembling and my heart breaking when I felt someone step close to me, his shadow dark against the flowers. And instead of offering comfort, he leaned in and whispered in a voice so cold it cut through my grief, asking me where the company paperwork was, as if my child's body was not even in front of us, as if all that mattered was the money she left behind. For a moment I thought I had misheard, but the look in his eyes told me I hadn't. That was the moment I knew this story was not going to end with her funeral. It was only beginning. Thank you so much for watching and giving me a little of your time. It means more than I can ever put into words. And before I go on, I would love to know where you are watching from, so please tell me in the comments, because it gives me comfort to know these stories are heard by people near and far. When I walked away from that coffin after hearing his words, I felt my knees grow weak, but I would not let myself fall. I kept my back straight and my mouth closed, because I knew if I opened it right, then the anger would spill out, and I did not want to give him that satisfaction. The silence in that moment was heavier than the church bells that rang outside. It was the silence of a mother who had already buried her child, and now had to stand face to face with the man who once abandoned her, now dressed in black pretending to grieve while his lips only shaped the word money. I pressed my hand against my chest as if to keep my heart from breaking open, and I promised myself right there that I would protect everything my daughter built, no matter what storm was coming my way. I should tell you who I am, because without knowing my story, you cannot understand why I stood so firm that day. My name is not important. What matters is that I am a mother who carried more weight on my shoulders than I ever thought I could. A woman who worked day and night so that her daughter would never feel like she had been left behind in this world. When my daughter was still young, she believed in love. She believed in promises, and she trusted the man who swore to stay by her side. But when she told him she was carrying his child, he turned his back and walked out the door without a glance behind him, leaving me to hold her trembling hands while she cried and asked why she was not enough for him to stay. I will never forget those nights. The way she pressed her face into her pillow and tried to hide her sobs so I would not hear, but I always heard, and I always sat quietly on the edge of her bed, stroking her hair and whispering that she was stronger than he ever knew. She carried on with a fire inside her that only grew brighter as the years passed. She studied hard, she worked in small jobs that never paid enough, and she sacrificed every comfort to build something of her own. I watched her save penny by penny until she was able to start her own company. And even when people doubted her, she never doubted herself. And I stood beside her through every struggle, every sleepless night, every setback that threatened to crush her spirit. Slowly, that company grew, and I could see pride shining in her eyes when she signed her first contract, when she held her first check, and when she told me, smiling through her exhaustion, that it was only the beginning. But life is cruel sometimes. It does not wait for us to be ready. And illness crept into her body like a thief in the night, stealing her strength, her laughter, and eventually her life. When she passed, she left me not only with the crushing weight of grief, but also with her most precious legacy, a handwritten letter folded carefully on top of her documents, words that will forever be burned into my memory. You were always the one who believed in me, Mom. Make sure my girl is raised right. Along with those words, she left her home, her business, and a life insurance policy worth $100,000. Not because she trusted the world, but because she trusted me. I clutched that letter in my hands as if it were a piece of her heart, and I swore to honor her wish, to guard her work, and to keep her memory alive. So when that man in black returned like a shadow from the past, asking about money as though love had never existed, as though he had earned the right to even whisper her name, I knew I was not just fighting for myself. I was fighting for her, and for everything she poured her soul into. The day of the funeral is carved into me as if it happened only yesterday. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies, the church filled with murmurs of people who came to pay their respects, some with tears in their eyes and some only out of duty. But I did not care who was sincere and who was not. All I cared about was the silence of the coffin that held my daughter, the one who had once filled every room with laughter and determination. I stood there with my granddaughter's small hand clutched tightly in mine, her eyes wide with confusion, too young to understand why her mother would not be coming home again. And I felt like I had to be a wall of strength for her, even though inside I was breaking into pieces. It was in that moment of vulnerability, in that raw wound of grief, that he appeared. The man who had left 18 years earlier, walking through the church doors dressed in black, polished shoes clicking against the floor as if he belonged among us. People turned and whispered, some in recognition, others in surprise, and I could feel the chill that ran down my spine when he approached, his expression carefully arranged into something like sorrow. But his eyes betrayed him. They were not the eyes of a grieving man. They were the eyes of someone calculating, watching, measuring what could be taken. He stood by the coffin, lowered his head for only a breath, and then turned to me with that whisper I will never forget. The words sharp as knives, asking where the company paperwork was, as though this was a meeting room and not the resting place of the woman he once abandoned. I did not answer. I could not, because rage swelled so deep inside me that if I opened my mouth, I feared the church walls themselves would hear my fury. Instead, I tightened my grip on my granddaughter's hand and turned my face away, walking slowly down the aisle as though his voice did not matter. But every step I took echoed with the weight of his betrayal. The people who watched may have thought I was avoiding a scene, but the truth was I was holding my dignity like a shield, refusing to lower myself to his level in that sacred moment. Still, as I walked out into the sunlight, my heart knew this was not over. His greed would not be satisfied by silence, and the storm that followed would test every ounce of strength I had left. I sat later that night at the kitchen table, the letter from my daughter spread before me, her handwriting steady and clear, telling me she trusted me to protect everything she had built. The words blurred through my tears, but they also gave me fire, because if he thought I would let him strip away her legacy after all she had endured, then he did not know the woman I had become. I whispered to myself in that empty house, promising my daughter's memory that I would stand tall against him, no matter who he brought with him, no matter what tricks he tried, because love and truth are heavier than greed, and I would not let her down. That night stretched on endlessly. The house was too quiet. Every creak of the wood and whisper of the wind pressed down on me as I sat at that table, staring at the letter again and again, tracing the lines of my daughter's handwriting with trembling fingers, as though by touching the ink I could bring her back. My mind wandered back 18 years, back to the night he walked out, the sound of the door slamming so loud it shook the walls, and the sight of my daughter sinking onto the floor, clutching her stomach and whispering that she would do it alone if she had to. I remember how I knelt beside her, how I told her she was not alone, that I would be her shield, her partner, her strength when hers faltered, and I meant it, because from that night on, it was us against the world. She faced every cruel whisper, every doubt cast upon her by people who thought she would fail, and I watched her transform that pain into fuel, building step by step a company that reflected her courage. The long nights at her desk, the tears she tried to hide when bills stacked higher than the money in her account, the moments of triumph when she finally signed contracts that proved she was more than what he left behind. I saw it all, and I stood proudly at her side through every moment. That is why when I closed my eyes that night after the funeral, his face came back to me with that greedy whisper, and I felt the anger rise so strong it made my chest burn. Because he had no right, no claim, no place in what she left behind. I thought of the years he had been gone, how he had not sent a letter, not a dollar, not a single sign of care, while I watched my daughter grow weary and yet stronger every day, until she finally made something she could pass on to her child. How dare he show up now, wearing black like a costume, pretending to grieve when all he wanted was to take what he had never lifted a finger to build. I sat there until dawn, watching the first light slip across the kitchen floor, and I whispered again to that letter, telling my daughter I would not let him win, that her legacy was safe with me. It was then I knew, deep in my bones, that the silence I gave him in that church was not the end. It was only the opening act, because men like him do not go away quietly. They come back louder, uglier, and more determined, and I had to be ready when he did. I did not have to wait long, because the very next morning, before the sun had fully risen, and before I had even poured myself a cup of coffee, there was a knock at the door, sharp and steady, the kind of knock that carries arrogance in its rhythm. I opened it, and there he stood again, but this time he was not alone. Beside him was a man in a pressed suit carrying a briefcase, his expression cold and practiced, the kind of look that told me he was used to winning battles not with fists, but with papers and signatures. The ex did not even pretend to mourn now. His eyes gleamed with entitlement, and before I could speak, the lawyer cleared his throat and said with a voice that carried no sympathy, "We're here to claim what's rightfully his." For a moment the world felt like it tilted beneath me, but I steadied myself, gripping the edge of the doorframe with one hand, because I would not let them see me bend. My heart was pounding, my palms were damp, yet my voice came out calm, steady, and sharp, telling them that nothing in this house, nothing in this company, and not a single cent of that insurance belonged to him, that he had abandoned his rights the day he walked away from my daughter's life. He smirked at me, that same cruel smirk I remembered from years ago, and he leaned slightly closer as if to intimidate me. But I did not step back. Inside I was trembling, but I held my ground, and I let the silence stretch between us until the air itself felt heavy with it. I could see the lawyer shifting, pulling out papers, ready to wave them in my face as if they could erase 18 years of absence. But what neither of them knew was that I was not standing as helpless as they imagined. I had spent that sleepless night not only remembering my daughter, but also gathering my strength, reminding myself of every promise I had ever made to her. And I knew that when the time came, I would not be alone in this fight. So I looked him in the eye and told him firmly that if he wanted a battle, then a battle was what he would get, because I had no intention of surrendering her legacy to the same man who destroyed her hope all those years ago. What I did not tell him in that moment, what I held close like a hidden card, was that someone else was about to step forward, someone who had been part of my daughter's life in ways he never even suspected. And when that truth surfaced, it would shatter every illusion of power he thought he had. As he stood there puffed up with arrogance, and his lawyer began unfolding papers as though they were weapons, I felt a stillness settle over me, because deep down I knew the moment had come for the truth to surface. The truth I had guarded quietly while I let them believe they held the upper hand. Before either of them could say another word, I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. Slow and steady, each step carrying the weight of authority. And when he appeared at my side, the air in the room shifted. He was not just a visitor or a friend. He was the man who had stood beside my daughter through every storm, the partner who had built her company with her, the one she had secretly married only months before her illness took her life. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a fire that made even the lawyer pause. The ex blinked, his smug smile faltering as if he had seen a ghost, and his words stumbled over themselves as he tried to understand who this man was and why he stood so confidently beside me. I did not have to explain, because the man I now called my ally spoke with a voice so clear and sharp it cut through every pretense, telling them that they had no legal standing here, no right to even make these demands, because the marriage certificate, the company documents, and the will itself all bore his name and mine. He pulled from his folder the papers that truly mattered, not lies written on blank threats, but proof of love, partnership, and trust. Documents my daughter had carefully prepared to make sure her legacy would be safe from vultures. I watched the lawyer's face change as his eyes scanned those lines, the color draining slowly from his cheeks, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind as he realized this was not the simple case of intimidation he had been promised. The ex, on the other hand, grew red with rage, his voice rising, demanding to know what kind of trick this was, but his anger only exposed his desperation, because in his heart he knew the truth had caught up with him. I stood there quietly, my grief still raw, my body still aching from loss, but in that moment I felt a strength I had not felt in years, because I was no longer fighting alone. I looked at him directly, letting him see the resolve in my eyes, and I thought to myself that he had underestimated not just me, but the memory of the woman he once abandoned, and the family she built that he could never again be a part of. The room grew heavier after those words were spoken, the silence pressing down on all of us, as if the walls themselves were listening. And I could see the lawyer fidgeting, shifting his weight, as though he already knew the fight was slipping through his hands. But the ex was not ready to let go. He leaned forward with that same arrogance that had always defined him, his voice sharp and loud as he shouted that none of this could be real, that my daughter would never have kept something like this from him. His denial was almost laughable, but I did not laugh. I only stood taller, my hands folded in front of me, watching him rage against a truth that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to surface. The man beside me did not flinch. He simply laid down each document one by one. The marriage certificate signed with my daughter's steady hand, the updated will with her words leaving everything to her mother and her husband, and the company papers that bore both of their signatures, evidence of partnership not just in business but in life. Every page was like a nail closing the coffin on his lies, and with each one I saw his face tighten, his voice grow more desperate, until his words no longer carried weight, but only the sound of a man grasping at air. I remember the lawyer clearing his throat, his eyes flicking nervously between the documents and his client, and in that moment I saw the power drain from their side of the room, because no amount of threats or arrogance could erase the truth staring them in the face. Still, the ex tried to twist his words, claiming that he was the rightful one, that blood gave him a place at the table. But I met his gaze with a calm that seemed to unnerve him, and I told him softly but firmly that blood means nothing when loyalty and love have long been abandoned. His lips trembled with fury, but he had no answer, because deep inside he knew I was right. It was not just a confrontation of papers and words, it was a collision of two worlds, his built on greed and absence, and mine built on years of sacrifice and love. And as I stood there, I realized this was more than a legal battle. It was a moment of justice, the kind that carries the voice of the one no longer here, echoing through every signed line and every choice she had made to protect what mattered most. He tried to recover himself, his fists clenching at his sides as he spat out that if we thought a few papers would stop him, we were mistaken, that he would take this matter to court and drag us through every hearing until he got what he believed was his. His voice was loud, almost shaking with fury, but beneath that anger I heard fear, the kind of fear that comes when a man realizes the ground beneath him is crumbling. I stood steady, my eyes locked on his, and I told him that if it was the law he wanted, then the law would be the very thing to bury his claims, because we had proof of every year he had been absent, every court record that showed his failure to provide support, every line that marked his silence when his daughter needed him most. The lawyer glanced at me then, and I could see the truth dawning in his expression. Because he knew cases are not built on anger. They are built on evidence. And our evidence stretched back 18 years, a trail of neglect too heavy to deny. The man beside me, my daughter's husband and partner, pulled out more documents, showing bank records, company ledgers, even testimonies that marked the ex's complete absence from her life, and the lawyer's eyes sank lower with each page. The ex grew louder, his face flushed red, his words spilling out like venom. But the more he shouted, the smaller he seemed, because arrogance cannot stand tall when truth begins to tower over it. I could feel my chest tighten as I watched him flail, because I remembered the girl my daughter once was, sitting broken-hearted in her bedroom when he left. And now here he was again, still trying to take, still trying to wound. But this time he was met not with tears but with walls of strength, documents that spoke louder than his voice, and a family that refused to yield. I told him calmly that this fight was never his to begin with, that he had forfeited any right the day he chose to walk away, and that every step he took from that night 18 years ago had been a step farther from any claim he could ever make. My voice did not rise, But I saw it pierce him deeper than any scream could. Because there is nothing more painful to a man like him than being confronted with the truth of his own abandonment. In that moment, I felt the weight shift, the balance tilt, and I knew we were no longer standing on the defensive. We were standing on the side of victory. Because no matter how loud he became, no matter how many times he threatened, the truth was now too strong to be undone. And it was tightening around him like chains he could not escape. The lawyer finally lowered his eyes, his voice no longer carrying the confidence it had when he first walked through my door. And in that silence, I felt the shift become undeniable, because power had left their side and settled firmly on ours. The ex, however, refused to accept what was plain before him, his voice breaking into a bitter shout as he accused us of trickery, as if love and commitment could be faked on paper, as if years of absence could be erased with nothing more than his demands. I watched him closely, his hands shaking now not with confidence but with desperation, and I realized that the man who had once walked away without looking back was now clawing at the walls of a house that no longer had any place for him. The man beside me did not waver. He leaned forward with calm authority and reminded them again that everything had been set in motion long before this confrontation, that my daughter had been careful, thoughtful, and deliberate in her choices, and that nothing they said could undo the decisions she made with clarity and love. He laid down the final page, the will signed with her steady hand, her words leaving all she owned to her mother and her husband. And when the lawyer read that line aloud, his voice faltered, and I saw the ex's face contort with disbelief, as though hearing her wishes spoken aloud was a wound deeper than he expected. I took a slow breath and stepped closer, my eyes never leaving his, and with a voice that carried both my grief and my strength, I told him that he had made his choice 18 years ago when he walked away, and that choice had followed him here like a shadow, stripping him of every right he thought he could reclaim. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words, but there were none left for him to speak. For the first time in all those years, it was not my daughter who was left broken by his absence. It was him who was left broken by the truth of his own actions. The room was so quiet then that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching out like a reminder that time does not erase responsibility, it only reveals it more clearly. And as I stood there watching him shrink beneath the weight of everything he had tried to deny, I felt a calm settle over me, because I knew that justice had already begun to take its course. And no matter how much noise he made, nothing could change the fact that the past he abandoned had finally caught up to him. He stood there trembling with rage, his lawyer shuffling uneasily at his side, and for a moment it almost seemed like he might lunge forward and tear the papers from the table, but the truth held him back, because even his anger could not undo the signatures staring him in the face. The lawyer finally spoke, his voice low and stripped of its earlier arrogance, saying there was nothing more to be done, that the documents were valid and the case was unwinnable. And with those words, I saw the fight drain out of them like water leaking from a cracked glass. The ex's face twisted, his pride shattered in front of me, and he muttered curses under his breath, but all his noise sounded small compared to the quiet strength that filled the room. I did not move, I simply looked at him, holding his gaze, as he realized he had lost, and in that silence, I gave him back the same dismissal he had once given my daughter 18 years ago. The same cold turning away he had left her with when she begged him to stay. This time it was not him walking out first, it was me standing tall, unbending, making him see that his place in our lives had ended long ago, and could never be restored by money or force. I told him clearly that my daughter's legacy would never pass through his greedy hands, that the company she built with sweat and sacrifice would remain safe with those who loved her, and that the money she left behind was a symbol of trust, not a prize for someone who had vanished when she needed him most. His lawyer gathered the briefcase and papers quietly, avoiding my eyes, and I saw the weight of shame pressing down on him, because he knew he had walked into a fight he could not win, and the ex, red-faced and trembling, had no choice but to follow him. I watched them turn and walk toward the door, each step heavy with defeat. And I felt no joy, no triumph, only a deep calm that settled in my chest. Because it was not victory I sought, it was justice. And in that moment, justice had been served. When the door closed behind them, the silence that followed was not the silence of fear or grief anymore. It was the silence of peace. The kind that comes when you know the storm has passed and the house still stands strong. I looked down at the papers again, the signatures, the proof of everything my daughter had worked for, and I whispered softly to her memory that it was done. That he would never touch what she left behind, that her voice still echoed in these walls even though she was gone. And as I held that thought close, I realized that what had just happened was more than the end of his demands. It was the closing of a chapter that had begun with his betrayal nearly 2 decades ago. And now, finally, that chapter was finished. When the door shut behind them, I stayed still for a long moment, letting the weight of it all sink into me. The years of carrying my daughter through her pain, the nights I held her when she cried, the pride I felt watching her build something from nothing, and the ache of losing her too soon. My hands rested on the documents spread across the table, and though they were only papers, to me, they were living proof of her determination, her resilience, and her love. Every line a reminder that she had thought of us even in her final days. I whispered to her as if she could hear me, telling her that her trust had not been misplaced, that I had stood firm as she asked me to, and that her company, her home, and the money she left were still safe, untouched by those who had abandoned her. I looked at my granddaughter then, her eyes wide and searching, trying to understand what had just happened, and I pulled her close, holding her against me with a strength I didn't know I still had. I told her softly that her mother had built everything with love, not greed, and that one day she would understand the power of sacrifice and the meaning of trust. She did not speak. She only rested her head against me, and in that silence I felt my daughter's presence again, as though she were standing in the room watching over us, her spirit woven into every wall, every memory, every heartbeat that remained in that house. The man who left us so long ago had returned, hoping to break what was left. But instead, he had been forced to see that love and loyalty cannot be stolen, that legacy cannot be claimed by someone who never earned it. His defeat was not loud. It did not come with shouts or clashes. It came quietly, in the way truth always wins, steady and unshakable. I felt peace settle over me for the first time since the day my daughter took her last breath, because I knew that I had honored her wish, I had shielded her memory, and I had kept the promise I made to her the night she cried on my shoulder when he walked away. That night I sat once more at the kitchen table, the letter in my hands, and I read it again, slower this time, letting each word sink deeper. And I realized that her faith in me had been my greatest strength, the anchor that kept me from falling apart. I whispered to her that I would continue to fight for what she left behind. Not for money, not for pride, but for the love that bound us, the love that no betrayal could ever destroy. And as I closed my eyes, I felt calm at last, knowing her voice still lived through me. In the days that followed, I moved through the house with a lighter step, not because the grief had left me, but because I no longer carried the weight of fear that someone would come and strip away what my daughter worked so hard to build. I tended to her company. I kept her home warm, and I poured love into every corner of my granddaughter's life, knowing that was what she had asked of me in that final letter. Sometimes at night, I would sit in her room, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume still lingering on her clothes, and I would remind myself that though she was gone, her strength remained, living in every choice I made, in every stand I took. The man who tried to take it all away was gone, his shadow no longer reaching our door, and what was left behind was peace, steady and quiet, the kind of peace my daughter deserved. Thank you, my dears, for staying with me until the very end of this story. It means more than I can say. And if my words touched your heart, please remember to subscribe, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and leave me a comment so I know where you are watching from. Until next time, stay strong and stay blessed.